Welcome to One Chapter, One Thought. Today's reading is from the book of Acts, chapter 14. In Iconium, Paul and Barnabas entered the synagogue of the Jews together and spoke in such a manner that a large number of people believed, both Jews and Greeks. But the Jews who disbelieved stirred up the minds of the Gentiles and embittered them against the brothers. Therefore, they spent a long time there speaking boldly with reliance upon the Lord, who was testifying to the word of his grace, granting that signs and wonders be done by their hands. But the people of the city were divided. Some sided with the Jews, and some sided with the apostles. And when an attempt was made by both the Gentiles and the Jews with their rulers to mistreat and to stone them to death, they became aware of it and fled to the cities of Iconium, Lystra, and Derbe, and the surrounding regions. And there they continued to preach the gospel. At Lystra, a man was sitting who had no strength in his feet. He was lame from his mother's womb, and he never walked. This man was listening to Paul as he spoke, who, when he had fixed his gaze on him and had seen that he had faith to be made well, said with a loud voice, "Stand upright on your feet." And he leapt up and began to walk. When the crowd saw what Paul had done, they raised their voice, saying in Iconium language, "The gods have become like men and have come down to us." They began calling Barnabas Zeus and Paul Hermes because he was the chief speaker. The priest of Zeus, whose temple was just outside the city, brought oxen and garlands to the gates and wanted to offer sacrifices with the crowds. But when the apostles Barnabas and Paul heard of it, they tore their robes and rushed out of the crowd. They cried out and said, "Men, why are you doing these things? We are also men of the same nature as you, and preach the gospel to you, that you should turn from these vain things to a living God who made the heaven and the earth and the sea and all that is in them. In the generations gone by, God permitted all the nations to go their own way, yet he did not leave himself without a witness, in that he did good. He gave you rains from heaven and fruitful seasons, satisfying your hearts with food and gladness." Even saying these things with difficulty, they restrained the crowds from offering sacrifices to them. But the Jews came from Antioch and Iconium, and having won over the crowds, they stoned Paul and dragged him out of the city, supposing him to be dead. And while the disciples stood around him, he got up and entered the city. The next day he went away with Barnabas to Derbe. And after they preached the gospel to that city and had made many disciples, they returned to Lystra and to Iconium and to Antioch, strengthening the souls of the disciples, encouraging them to continue in the faith and saying, "Through many tribulations we must enter the kingdom of God." When they had appointed elders for them in every church, having prayed with fasting, they commended them to the Lord in whom they had believed. They passed through Pisidia and came into Pamphylia. When they had spoken the word in Perga, they went down to Attalia, and from there they sailed to Antioch, from which they had been commended to the grace of God for the work that they had accomplished. When they had arrived and gathered the church together, they began to report all things that God had done with them, and how he opened a door of faith to the Gentiles, and they spent a long time with the disciples. One thought. This is one of my favorite chapters in the whole book of Acts. It's one of my favorite chapters because I'm so inspired by the Apostle Paul here. Paul preaches the gospel to a pagan Gentile people in verses 8 through 18. And then ironically, the Jews, they've become missionaries, but missionaries of hostility. They're kind of chasing Paul around from city to city, and they're stirring up the crowds against him. And so they come to Antioch, and they win over the crowds. And then they stone Paul almost to death. They pick up rocks. And in those days, stoning someone to death meant you just pick up rocks and you just start chucking at the person, hitting them. I mean, you can imagine the damage it would do to your body. If you've ever been hit by a baseball, it's not pleasant. And these are rocks that are getting pelted at him. And so Paul probably falls into shock because they think he's dead. And he's just laying on the ground. And then the disciples are standing around him. I imagine there's like a circle around him. They're all looking down at him and like, is this guy dead? And then it says, while the disciples stood around him in verse 20, Paul got up and entered the city. Talk about toughness, right? That's what's so inspiring to me is Paul's toughness here. And I think so often we just need to get tougher in life. We just need to be tougher. Paul almost dies, and then he gets up and he goes back to the city that he was dragged out of and almost died in. And then he gets up and he goes to another city, Derbe, which is 60 miles away. One of the themes throughout the book of Acts is that perseverance is the difference. There's all this opposition, there's all this persecution, there's all these people coming against the gospel. Everyone is trying to stop the gospel from going out, but nothing can. And part of the way that happens is God working through real people to persevere, to have endurance. And the more that I've lived, the more that I've realized is that nothing is ever accomplished that matters without perseverance. Life is tough, but we need to be tougher. And especially as Christians, we know first and foremost that our future is secure in Jesus, to be with God forever, but also that we have like a great mission. Even if we're not in full-time ministry, we have this great mission from the Lord to make a positive impact in the world, to show love to those around us, to build great businesses which bless others and solve problems and meet needs and work in businesses that are tangibly helping people. We can do that because we're motivated by the love of God. And in order to accomplish these things, it requires a good measure of toughness. Those times when you're feeling beaten down and discouraged and you're not sure how you could go on, maybe just remember these verses. Paul almost died, got up, and he went to the city.